Good evening. I think most of you know I'm Peter Gluckman. I'm Director of COI2, the Centre for Informed Futures. And many of people ask me what's the unifying theme for COI2, which is obviously looking at long-term issues. And if we had to say what was the unifying theme, it's really about the future of society and the future of social cohesion. And over the last 5 years, we've been leading not only work in New Zealand, which you've seen in a number of our reports, but also developing an international consortium of academics who think about what's really going on around the liberal democracies in terms of polarisation, fractionation, and what we might do to stop it. And it's a much more complex issue than just talking about the social media or the internet or sociological change. One has to also think in evolutionary terms and how identities are formed and how groups form and how they interact with each other. And one of the early people we interacted with is Harvey Whitehouse. Harvey is Professor of, I better get the title right, Harvey, of Social Cohesion at the University of Oxford, where he heads the institute, he heads the Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion. Harvey is a very distinguished anthropologist, and he'll tell you a lot about his adventures, which range from New Guinea to Vanuatu to Libya to places like England even, in studying how groups form, how they bond, and the kinds of bonding they take, and how they fracture and interact with each other. He studies a lot from the perspective of ritual, not just the ritual of religion, although that's one of his particular areas of expertise, but also about different kinds of ritual which either bond us tightly or loosely into our group identities and how they work. And over the last 4 or 5 years, we've been working in a series of workshops in London and Paris, and he's here now, as we try to develop with people like Quentin Atkinson, who's in the audience, and the team at COI2, a body of thinking which might turn from being theoretical to actually being practical. What can we actually do to stop the divisive forces actually tearing societies, particularly liberal democracies, apart? And so I'm not going to say anything more because I think some of it is in Harvey's books. If you read about the book, The Ritual Animal, which is one of the most impressive books on the topic of how ritual binds or doesn't bind people, but also his work that he's about to talk about, his new book coming out, Inheritance, in a few weeks' time. So with that, I'll turn over to Harvey.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that lovely introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming along this afternoon. I'm an anthropologist, and a major focus of my research is on how groups become bonded together and how that impacts their ability to cooperate. And as Peter just said, this has taken me into the heart of some extraordinarily cohesive groups all around the world. My personal interest in the whole topic began at quite a remote location in the mountains of Papua New Guinea in the late 1980s, where I went to conduct 2 years of field research as part of my doctoral project in anthropology at the University of Cambridge at that time. And the group I lived with took me in as a member of their tribe, helping me to learn their unwritten language and the intricacies of their ancient culture. Many of my friends in the rainforest had joined a newly established cult, repudiating all acts of violence in the belief that this new way of life would bring their ancestors back from the dead, ushering in a sort of period of peace and plenty. But prior to the spread of these ideas, or indeed the arrival of missionaries, the region had a long history of tribal warfare, and many of the cultural institutions I ended up studying served to bind together military units through intensely painful rituals associated with all-male warrior cults. Some of the older men in my tribe described homicidal exploits with obvious enthusiasm, but, and this is crucially important, those actions didn't seem to be motivated or even justified by hardline religious or fundamentalist ideologies, as we might expect in many paramilitary groups in other parts of the world. I came to realize that what really drove their warlike behavior were not doctrines of hate, but actually a very intense form of love. Love of their fellow warriors, love of their in-group. The love that bonded together male raiding parties in the New Guinea rainforest was forged through pain and suffering, especially the agonies of male initiations, which involve, for example, in this group, wearing heavy masks supported on their backs by cassowary bone driven deep into the skin at the base of their spines. And these masks would be daubed in blood extracted from their tongues using a very sharp leaf. These huge masks, many with grotesquely enlarged eyes and gaping mouths, a bit like one you can see in this photograph, were strictly taboo to women and children who would run and hide whenever they came near, and were forbidden to enter the areas of the forest where men and initiated boys met in secret to construct those masks and plan their rituals. The shared ordeals of the male cult produced such powerful bonds of solidarity that every initiated man knew that he could bank on his fellows to stand by him on the battlefield, come what may. When I first learned about this form of intense group bonding, I didn't really know what to call it, and still less did I have any method of measuring it. But later, I became involved in collaborations with social psychologists aimed at developing a construct known as identity fusion. Now, to understand fusion, it's important to appreciate that we all have basically two kinds of identities. On the one hand, we have a personal self, qualities that make us unique as individuals. But on the other hand, we're also members of groups, and sometimes we wear many different kinds of hats as members of lots of different kinds of groups. Most people, most of the time, see their personal and their group identities as quite distinct and separate. So, if you make people's group identities salient, their personal identities become less accessible. In psychology, this form of alignment with groups is known as identification, and it's essentially a kind of depersonalizing form of group alignment. But with fusion, it's really different from that. If you're fused with a group, then the boundary between your personal and group identities becomes more porous. So when your personal self is made salient, your group identity is also made salient at the same time, and it actually fosters a kind of enhanced sense of inner strength, even a sense of invulnerability. And it works the other way around as well. If you make the group salient to a fused individual, this taps directly into a sense of personal agency. So people who are highly fused with a group say that they'll do pretty much anything to protect their fellow group members, risking or even, if necessary, laying down their lives to save those other members of the group. Now, the earliest measures of identity fusion were pictorial. Respondents basically viewed a series of pictures, the ones you see on the screen. Each picture contained a small circle, that's you, and a big circle, that's your group, that intersect to varying degrees, as you can see. At one end of the spectrum, the two circles are completely separate, but at the other end, the little circle, that's your personal identity, is shown as being completely contained within the larger circle representing your group. And people, presented with this pictorial measure asked to say which of these representations best characterizes their relationship to the group. And the people who choose that one on the end are said to be fused. Later, a set of verbal measures were developed, and you can see those on the screen as well. And with both the pictorial and the verbal fusion measures, the term group could be supplanted by a more specific term, something like, for example, country, it's an example in this slide, or church, or family, or even individuals, like a brother or a spouse. And that made it possible to measure levels of fusion with a wide variety of different kinds of groups, and also relational networks and dyads and other kinds of phenomena. Now, one of the ways in which people become fused with a group is by sharing emotionally intense experiences, and particularly painful, frightening, negative kinds of events. And part of the reason for this seems to be that dysphoric experiences often are more intense emotionally and impactful emotionally in the long run compared with more euphoric ones. So, for example, the football teams that lose a lot typically have more tightly fused and more loyal supporters. We call this, right, you should join the crappy teams, really, if you want to have a really loyal support base around you. It involves basically this shared dysphoria pathway to fusion. It involves going through a kind of memorable, transformative experience that becomes part of your essential personal self, your essential personal narrative. So those are the things that uniquely make you, or that make me. And when those kinds of experiences define not only your personal identity, but also that of your group, it leads to fusion. Now, our research has shown that sharing transformative experiences is not the only way in which people can end up being fused with a group. Another common pathway to fusion is sharing biologically inherited traits, or believing that you share common ancestors and family ties and things like that, shared biology. In a large study of identical and fraternal twins, for example, we've shown that shared biology, as measured by zygosity, predicts fusion with twin independently of shared dysphoric experiences. So these are two kind of distinct pathways to fusion. And not surprisingly, just as we have cultural institutions that focus on sort of cultivating feelings of shared suffering, such as the painful initiation rituals I was talking about a bit earlier, we also have cultural institutions that emphasize shared ancestry, such as beliefs about, having shared ethnic origins and tribal ancestor heroes and other ideas along those lines. Military groups and gangs exploit these psychological tendencies in a range of ways by putting their members through excessively painful ordeals, for example, in the form of hazing or brutal forms of boot camp. And they also do it by requiring people, members of those groups, to wear very similar bodily adornments, whether we're talking about military uniforms or gang insignia and things like that. These conventions convey the impression of being more similar physically, and therefore more like clansmen who are descended from the same tribal ancestors. We also know from numerous studies that moving in synchrony kind of tricks the brain into thinking that other people's bodies are really extensions of one's own body, so that also kind of enhances feelings of fusion between the personal self and the group. So it's no accident that such groups often engage in various kinds of synchronous movement, things like marching and drilling and parading and dancing and those sorts of things. Those kinds of behaviors increase fusion with the group, and in turn the willingness to sacrifice yourself when it's needed for the sake of the group. And numerous studies have shown that the more fused you are with the group, the more willing you are to fight and die to protect it from perceived enemies. So, we had a well-developed theory of what causes identity fusion, and evidence that fused individuals were more likely to express a willingness to fight and die for their groups. But would they actually do that in practice? To find out, we needed to find a population of a group of people basically who not only talk the talk, but were also willing to walk the walk. Actually, that is to say, to put their lives on the line for their fellow group members, even when the chances of getting killed doing so were extremely high. Well, an opportunity to do that arose in 2011 during the Arab Spring, when one of my students managed to get into Libya in the midst of the revolution using his UN contacts. And with his help, I was able to come to Misrata to join him. And together we designed a survey with insurgent groups where over 2,000 rebels and civilians had recently been killed in their efforts to repel Gaddafi's forces. Our survey was run with 179 members of various revolutionary battalions. These battalions, a battalion in Arabic is a katiba. Half our sample were frontline fighters, and half provided logistical support to the frontline fighters. So they did things like fixing vehicles, driving ambulances, that kind of thing. Among the overwhelming majority of insurgents, we recorded pretty much ceiling levels of fusion with several groups, including family, the people who were your kind of friends in your katiba, and even people they'd never met from other battalions. But we found floor levels of fusion with fellow Libyans who supported the revolution, so they're on the same side, but were not members of a katiba. In other words, it didn't seem to matter that people shared your beliefs or were, on the same side as you ideologically. What mattered was being a member of the groups that had suffered together. So we said to participants in this survey, we get, that you're fused with multiple groups, but if you had to choose one, which would it be? So basically this is a forced choice question. And here we found a striking difference between frontline fighters and providers of logistical support. If you're a frontline fighter, you were far more likely to choose your friends in the katiba over your own family. And this was a really striking finding because it meant that your fellow fighters seemed to be more like family than your actual family. In the case of the providers of logistical support, that wasn't the case. And that made sense in terms of our theory, because, we expected those who suffered more shared dysphoria on the front line to be more fused. But we couldn't rule out the alternative possibility that, what if fusion is what drove those fighters to the front line in the first place? So we need to kind of sort out the causal arrows here. Well, to try and adjudicate on that question, we ran a series of studies with US troops who served in various wars in Vietnam, in Afghanistan and Iraq, but who crucially had no control over their deployment. And here we found again that intensity of suffering on the front line was associated with high levels of fusion with your unit. So this seemed to be quite compelling support for our hypothesis that sharing these sort of dysphoric experiences on the front line is what is driving the higher levels of fusion. Well, in 2018, I published an article in the journal Behavioral and Brain Sciences setting out what I call the fusion plus threat model of violent self-sacrifice. The goal here was to explain not only why soldiers in conventional armies are willing to fight and die for each other, but also why terrorists are willing to blow themselves up to advance their cause. One of the kind of attractive features of behavioral and brain sciences, it's not unique to this journal, but it's one of the few that does this, is that they invite commentaries which they publish alongside the main article. In this case, my paper attracted more commentaries than usual, which meant that basically we benefited from the critical feedback of more than 50 experts on the topic. And distilling all this feedback and combining it with my sort of fusion plus threat model led to the hypothesis that many forms of violent extremism were a product of at least 4 key factors, which are shown on this slide. Firstly, identity fusion resulting from shared experiences of suffering, for example. Secondly, the presence of a clearly defined enemy that posed a very real and salient threat to the group. Thirdly, norms justifying the use of violence, which of course is a defining feature of all military or paramilitary organizations, and fourthly, a tendency to dehumanize the enemy. Now, to build on those ideas, I teamed up with Julia Ebner, who's an expert on extreme groups, who'd been studying them undercover for some years. And together we came up with a plan to try to identify would-be terrorists before it's too late, building on these ideas that came out of the BBS Behavioral and Brain Sciences discussion. And one of the biggest problems that face that are facing the sort of intelligence community is how to spot terrorists among a vastly larger population of ideological extremists, people who espouse really unpleasant views, but who are actually unlikely ever to commit acts of violence themselves. So Julia and I set out to develop a set of methods for analysing statistically the words of political activists so that we could spot the telltale set of psychological traits that we predicted would lead to acts of self-sacrificial violence, such as suicide bombing. And we persuaded a stats expert, Chris Kavanagh, to help us analyse the data. Our first efforts to develop a set of diagnostic tools was based on the analysis of 15 manifestos written by a range of authors, from those who advocated peaceful methods to achieve their goals, to much more sort of hardline activists, including right-wing extremists and Islamists who ended up carrying out really deadly attacks. The aim of our analysis was to pick out language in the manifestos that served as sort of telltale indicators of our four predictor variables. That is, the features that we thought, when combined together, would allow us to predict which writers of manifestos were the ones who were ending up actually committing acts of violent extremism. And we found that nearly 90% of the killers in our sample exhibited all four characteristics in the language used in their manifestos. Those whose language revealed only 3 of the 4 key elements were comparatively harmless. That award-winning research is now helping the intelligence community in the UK and in Germany, and also internet platforms, to spot would-be terrorists through their online communications. Now, of course, detecting would-be terrorists is all very well, but an even more important problem is what to do about those people who are bent on acts of violence. If the perception of sharing self-defining experiences is one of the main ways in which extremists are fused to their groups, it may be possible to develop effective interventions, basically to defuse them at a crucial stage. And in my last book, The Ritual Animal, which Peter mentioned very briefly earlier, I argued that since deadly forms of identity fusion are often rooted in shared experiences of suffering, this, rather than extreme ideologies and doctrines, should really be the starting point for de-radicalization programs. I argued that in some cases it may be as simple as facilitating carefully managed discussions among people considered at risk of engaging in extreme pro-group actions of various kinds. And because, describing self-defining experiences to others in your group very often brings to the fore unacknowledged differences, which have the effect subtly of defusing participants who participate in an intervention like that. That may indeed actually help to explain why painful initiation rites are typically secret, in the groups that practice them, or why it's often taboo for soldiers to talk to each other about the horrors of frontline combat. Discussing those kinds of experiences doesn't seem to happen very naturally, so fostering it is something that would need to be incentivized and supported. In the case of would-be Islamist fighters, this might naturally involve buy-in from family members, from close friends, from teachers, imams, and others. The key thing to keep in mind is that this kind of intervention would not involve challenging the person's religious or political convictions. On the contrary, the focus is pretty much exclusively on personal experiences, something that on the face of it would not seem to be directly related to things like doctrine and ideology. Versions of this kind of diffusion approach could also be developed at scale through the use of responsible forms of media reporting, informed by what we now know about the pathways to fusion and to intergroup violence. So there are lots of possibilities there.
Yep.
In the UK and in many other democracies, it's common for politicians to favour ever more draconian measures to crack down on extreme beliefs. But our research suggests that curtailing freedom of speech is unlikely to provide a solution to violent extremism. In fact, it could have the very opposite effect of actually fueling perceptions of outgroup threat among people who are already highly fused. Our research suggests that we need to look beyond the rhetoric of activists and to focus instead on reducing that dangerous cocktail of psychological ingredients that really seems to lie at the heart of violent extremism. Diffusion techniques may prove to be an effective approach, and we're currently looking for opportunities to work with policy experts to develop interventions along those lines. But another potentially impactful approach, particularly when it comes to shaping attitudes in the general population, might be actually to extend fusion to wider groups. The finding that shared experiences of suffering trigger feelings of fusion with the group has taken us a long way toward understanding what motivates violent self-sacrifice, whether we're talking about revolutionary insurgents, soldiers in conventional armies, or suicide bombers. But what if the same mechanism could be harnessed to create bonds between opposing groups, even between enemies at war with one another? That may sound far-fetched, but recall that extraordinary things like, what's pictured here on this slide, the impromptu ceasefires that occurred during World War I around Christmas time in 1914 along the Western Front. To investigate whether shared experiences of the horrors of warfare could actually motivate fusion across enemy lines, we designed an experiment. On 24th of October last year, just weeks into the war between Israel and Hamas, John Alderdice gave a speech at the House of Lords in which he urged fellow politicians in the UK to support efforts to establish a lasting ceasefire. Lord Alderdice was a veteran campaigner for peace. In fact, he was leader of the Alliance Party in Northern Ireland between 1987 and 1998 and played a key role in the peace process in that region. Since the two of us had been in deep discussions for many years on the question of how to prevent and resolve intergroup conflicts, Lord Alderdice sent me the text of his speech. After reading it, I persuaded him to let me rewrite the core part of it, making the focus on shared suffering on both sides of the conflict. Now, as I've been saying, fusion is often rooted in feelings of shared suffering, but all too often what's happening is that the focus is exclusively on the grievances of the in-group and the ongoing threat posed by the out-group. But what if we were to turn that around and instead focus on the sufferings of both our own group and the sufferings of the enemy group? In theory, what that should do is motivate increased fusion with a kind of superordinate identity, an identity that encompasses both us and them. And that in turn should make us more willing to contemplate peaceful solutions, perhaps even to campaign actively for a lasting ceasefire in a conflict situation. That at least was the theory, but would it work in practice? Well, to find out, I invited Lord Alderdice to come to my college in Oxford to record his speech again. And this time he read out the version I'd written for him. So let me just play a couple of snippets from that speech, just to give you an idea.
I feel obliged to speak out terrible schemes and movements in Israel, Gaza, to the south of Florida. It's ridiculous to approach this debate calm McCartney drew a piece to car. Things happening in Israel and Gaza. And there's this natural rage with its revenge and to and the other. But what the truth is that the appalling suffering of the criminal conflict have been felt by large numbers of innocent citizens on those sides. Many of us are parents ourselves, who are surely now in extreme distress from both Israeli and Palestinian mothers and fathers who have seen their children mutilated and killed before their eyes. If we just pause to consider how this horrible suffering is actually shared on both sides, maybe there is time to turn it into a force for good. A force to convince us all to stop in our tracks, to fight back against the violence itself, rather than to fight back against each other.
So, armed with this recorded speech, one of my students, Lucas Reinhardt, worked with me to develop an online survey to run with a sample of Jewish and Muslim Americans. First, we asked them about their attitudes towards Palestinians and Israelis, focusing on fusion with the in-group and fusion with the out-group as well, so that we had a measure of both of those fusion levels. And also measures of feelings of trust and willingness to befriend members of the group. And then we got them to watch the speech that you just heard part of by Lord Alderdice. Afterwards, we repeated the attitude measures we'd used at the beginning, and we found evidence of remarkable change and in a positive direction, simply as a result of listening to the speech. And even more remarkably, when we repeated these measures with the same participants several days later, much of the positive attitude change persisted. In other words, the speech continued to impact people for some time afterwards. We don't know how long those effects lasted. Perhaps the effects would decay if you weren't exposed to another speech along similar lines. But it's also possible that for many people listening to that speech, it was just a starting point for thinking about the conflict in Gaza in a new way, perhaps driving a growing commitment to peace over the long run. Now, one reason for thinking that a single episode, such as watching a particularly moving or impactful speech, could change people's attitudes in the long run comes from a longitudinal study we carried out looking at how the fusion process unfolds over time, even when it starts with a single kind of one-off event. The event we were interested in was the killing of a lion in Zimbabwe in 2015. The story of this killing of the lion went viral almost immediately, causing a sort of outpouring of grief and anger around the world. Perhaps even as far away as here in New Zealand, some of you will remember the story of Cecil the lion. Well, in case you don't, let me just briefly recount what happened. Cecil basically was illegally shot by an American trophy hunter using a longbow. And soon afterwards, news of this killing went viral on the world's media. It so happened that a lion conservation unit at my university was responsible for tracking Cecil. And so tens of thousands of people were basically jamming the phone lines in Oxford, wanting to know how they could do something to support the efforts of that conservation unit to protect big cats from being hunted illegally. As soon as I heard about that, I asked the head of that unit if I could run a longitudinal survey with some of those concerned members of the public. Now, a particularly interesting feature of this study was that it showed how reflecting on Cecil's demise contributed to fusion with the lion, Cecil, and with those involved in lion conservation over a period of many months. So rather than thinking of fusion as a kind of knee-jerk reaction to something that happens, in the here and now, but then gets forgotten, it would be more accurate to think of it as a kind of long-term process. This finding is consistent with many other studies my colleagues and I have run, showing that fusion results from long-term reflection on impactful episodes. We've shown, for example, that the more people think about collective traumas, from things like the troubles in Northern Ireland to the memories of tribal warriors for childhood initiation rituals that they've been through, the more they become fused over time with the group that has suffered in that way. One of the take-homes from this kind of research is that politicians may have far more power than they realize to harness our capacity to become fused and committed to new courses of action. It's very plausible that a single moving and thought-provoking speech, if the words are well chosen, could impact people's thinking and behavior for years to come. With those ideas in mind, my colleagues and I have been thinking increasingly about how we could harness the power of fusion to address some of the greatest challenges facing humanity today. Consider, for example, the problem of climate change. All too often, this is seen as a problem that's best explained to us by the scientific community. But while scientific expertise is, of course, crucial to diagnosing the problem, getting us to act on it will depend on social cohesion rather than just rational argument alone. And one of the greatest sources of social cohesion in human history is religion, actually, rather than science. At the root of fusion in religion are feelings of shared suffering. These are cultivated, these feelings, by doctrines focusing on the sufferings of central figures such as the world-renouncing ordeals of the Buddha or of Christ on the cross. But just as often, they're also appealing to shared sufferings through arduous rituals or experiences of sectarian violence or persecution or oppression. All the world religions provide scriptural support for stewardship of the planet, yet very few religious leaders, governments or international bodies are asking how can we harness the cohesion of religions to tackle the climate crisis. It's a really missed opportunity if you think about the demographics, because the overwhelming majority of people in the world are religious. That's the fact. Roughly 7 billion believers compared with only about 500 million atheists. And there's evidence that people make many decisions, including environmental decisions, very substantially on the basis of their religious convictions. Some organizations already recognize that. Religions for Peace, for example, have issued rallying calls to their followers to act urgently on the climate crisis. The problem, though, is that such calls tend to preach to the converted and don't take full advantage of what we've learned about this psychology of group cohesion that I've been describing to you. We need to develop, I think, much more specific and targeted approaches. And here again, I found myself turning to a political leader for help, in particular the Minister for Climate Change in Vanuatu, Ralph Regenvanu. I first met Minister Ralph in March last year after landing in Port Vila in the immediate aftermath of one of the worst natural disasters in the country's history, where two massive tropical cyclones battered the capital of Vanuatu. I was one of the earliest foreigners to kind of travel around looking at the effects of these two terrible storms and design surveys to measure the effects of shared suffering on group cohesion in Vanuatu. After some discussion, the minister agreed to let me write for him a series of speeches about the need to act on the climate crisis, which he would then read out on camera. Our goal was to establish which of the speeches had the biggest effects on fusion and willingness to take action. What we found was that when Minister Ralph appealed to arguments about our shared humanity rather than to the arguments from science, this had a bigger impact on fusion and willingness to act on the climate crisis among people sampled in the UK, the US, and South Africa. We did, of course, wonder if this had something to do with the minister's personal charisma, which is considerable, but we also found that when I, a mere academic rather than an elected leader from the Global South, gave the same speeches on camera, we got very similar results. In short, when it comes to tackling the climate crisis, what really seems to move the dial for people seems to be the ideas that fuse us at least as much, if not more, than the arguments from science. In my new book, which is coming out in New Zealand in mid-June, I argue that the latest findings in the science of cohesion can be used to address many of the problems facing the world today. The climate crisis and intergroup conflict are just two of many examples discussed in the book. I also apply what we've learned to the phenomenon of populism, in which cohesion is used to polarize societies in ways that are detrimental to trust and to the core functioning of democratic institutions. I also focus on the way cohesion is harmfully exploited by the media and the advertising industry. But in all of these cases, I basically argue that we could turn things around by harnessing cohesion in more strategic ways. So let me end by considering just very briefly a problem I know weighs very heavily on many people's minds here in New Zealand. The psychology of group bonding in gangs is very similar to the kind of bonding we've studied also in military units and among football fans. It's a form basically of psychological kinship, often actually overriding bonds with family, particularly among young people who come from dysfunctional homes or have been rejected by their close kin. But just as criminal gangs can take the place of families, the same is true of sports teams and military organisations, all of which can foster more law-abiding values. And intuitively, that makes sense. Just think about the role of things like boxing clubs in tough neighbourhoods in America, or the way army recruiters in, say, the UK's inner cities have tried to handpick street fighters for military service. But only recently have we begun to understand how the same psychology that drives violence can also be harnessed in more productive and disciplined ways. For the past few years, my colleagues and I have been working with David Dein, one of the founders of the Premier League in the world of football, actually the man who also brought Arsene Wenger to Arsenal Football Club, one of our big clubs in the UK, to understand how love for football can help people in prison to turn their backs on a life of crime when they come back into society. David Dein is the founder of what he calls the Twinning Project, an initiative aimed at twinning professional football clubs across England and Wales to their local prisons, providing inmates with a chance to bond through a shared love of football. We've been studying the bonding process and how this changes the lives of participants in the project, and it really does. In essence, the more fused participants become with the Twinning Project, the less trouble they get into in prison, and the healthier and more resilient they become psychologically. We're currently conducting a longitudinal study to see how these positive effects will subsequently impact their prospects in life after they're released from prison. An obvious question is whether similar approaches in New Zealand, perhaps focusing on rugby rather than football as the sport of choice, might have similar effects. But there, I'm going to leave it for now. If there's time for questions, I'd really welcome that. If you found it interesting, please do pre-order the book. Anyway, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
So there's a couple of roving microphones, so we'll just use those, I think, to get around. But Gavin, you're close to the front, so maybe you can yell in the meantime.
I can yell, yes. Thank you very much for that. I can understand how this works with a physical organisation, be it an army unit or a gang. But how does it work with virtual units? I'm thinking here of lone wolf terrorists like Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch mosque attacker. Clear links to white extremists, but no known affiliation with a physical group. How does it work with people like that?
Well, I think it works in much the same way as it worked with those people who reacted to the death of Cecil the Lion. I mean, this was a case where people who had never interacted with lions found themselves sharing an experience in their minds with Cecil to such a degree and with such an intensity that, from their perspective, this was a genuinely shared experience. And that is a very unusual case, I admit. It's not common for people to fuse across the species barrier in that way. But this is what happened for many of those giving money to lion conservation. But I think what has been happening over the last 40 years or so is that news reporting of violence around the world has become more and more sort of visceral and immersive. You know, now instead of just reading things in a newspaper, people get to see these very intense images of ghastly things happening. And that feeling of shared experience becomes much more real, you know, without actually physically being in a war zone yourself. You can actually have a lot of the same experiences that would be generated by that kind of first-hand experience. So I think it's getting worse and worse.
To the point of tipping the balance to acts of violence?
Yes, I think the evidence is clear that a lot of those who end up travelling to war zones to participate in violence became radicalised as a result of immersive media. And we can see that the effects on terrorists, for instance, in the US, of the media has just grown and grown. You know, and social media has become much more significant in radicalising people. So vicariously shared experiences in that way can be very powerful and motivating.
There are a number of issues around the Tarrant shooting which are not known on the public forum, some of which never will be for security reasons, and also relevant politicians were not included within the Royal Commission set up by politicians. There's an overlapping between the two. There's a coroner's inquiry going on at the moment, which is uncovering some of those issues. I was going to congratulate you on your recent award for your linguistic analysis of online material and the implied encouragement for state security entities to rapidly invest in latest versions of computer science to be able to analyse the data coming through. Certainly one of the issues that come up that you raised with regard to diffusion technique, including families, is one that in Australia has been problematic. Based on the reaction of state security and law enforcement entities to families who may raise issues and people from vulnerable societies, particularly from countries where the authorities are not trusted, have discovered literally the hard way. If they raise any issues with state security, the police will come in with full force, wreck their houses, and it's not only the person they've expressed concern about that is targeted, but the families themselves, including facing deportation. So that there's not just the politician, but also a need to address reactions of security services and how they respond in a constructive way rather than a very destructive way that otherwise incentivizes people to say nothing. And the same with the misnomer of the lone wolf. Someone like Terrance was well known in communicating with others. It's the rabid wolf that you have to be careful of.
Yeah.
By nature, a loner, and extremely dangerous and unpredictable. And that's the issue that's still not being looked at with sufficient depth.
All good points, thank you.
Behind you, there's crispy immediately behind you.
Wanted to find out what your thoughts were on domestic terrorism, which is normally not talked about. When you look at, it's happened here in New Zealand where you've had KKK, Aryan Nation, National Front. United States, we saw January 6th, and here's the whole thing. You talk about the 4 points that happen where you can clearly see it. There were clear signs of January 6th before. The black community in the United States told them 3 weeks before it happened and totally ignored it because the majority ignored white terrorism. So what are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that the more that we learn about the cocktail of psychological ingredients that predicts these events, the more important and more urgent it becomes to start to respond, not necessarily by having more arrests. I don't think that is the right way to go about it, or to more repressive tactics. I think there are several organs of society that have a very neglected role in preventing these sorts of violent acts. I think the media, for example, could report far more responsibly than is currently the case. I think reforming the media and in particular, I think getting the very salacious kinds of reporting that the media engage in really do contribute, I think, to a lot of the kinds of phenomena that you're talking about. But I think there are also roles that our systems of education can play far more so than at present. I think there are many institutions of society that could become more actively involved in addressing this pathway to violent extremism, both domestically and internationally.
Right at the back.
Tēnā koe, Harvey. I was wondering if you can give us a little peek preview on your chapter about how we might shift the dial around climate change, please.
Sorry, you want me to give you a sneak preview of what exactly?
Last chapter.
Change chapter.
Oh, right. Well, the last chapter of this book is all about global cohesion and what we can do to increase feelings of cohesion as a species, and perhaps even our fusion with lots of other species that share the planet with us, and how we can translate that into cooperative outcomes. I think, my focus when it comes to climate change in the book has been on a variety of things, and I've done it with a little bit of trepidation because I know a lot of people say, that addressing the climate crisis is about structural change that is largely needs to be top down, and that when governments bang on about us all changing our behaviours as citizens and consumers, it's passing the buck. But I think, realistically, it's got to be both of those things, hasn't it? We've got to change our behaviours and have structural change. And I think when it comes to changing our own behaviours, I do think there's more that we could be doing to generate feelings of shared experience across humanity at large, and then harnessing that. I mentioned, how religions could be brought into the picture on this, but I think there are lots of ways in which we could do it in secular contexts as well. So the last chapter of the book is all about that, and there are lots of examples there.
And in fact, it's one of the things we've been discussing all morning today, is actually how, from my point of view and Harvey's point of view, how can we bring these two things together, actually find a way that might be realistic to think about. Because I agree with the point. I mean, at the last COP meeting before last, I made a speech on video which said the problem with the science of climate change was not knowing when the glaciers would melt or sea levels would rise, but how we actually change behaviour. And that's actually the fundamental issue. Behaviour both of politicians and behaviour of citizens. And that's the science that has not been done. And I think this is the core science that's needed. So that's some of the discussion we've been on while Harvey's here. Sorry.
Kia ora, Harvey. I appreciate your research on the use of identification and sort of dysphoria to sort of build upon the sort of both self and group fusion identity. So I probably would wonder if you want to comment on the sort of government policies on having youth offenders being put into boot camps, which could have also enforced that sort of state of dysphoria and therefore sort of social cohesion, as well as the banning of gang patches and identification as a way of reinforcing sort of law and order on gangs, which might also be perceived as a threat, where that could be sort of an opposite effect that the government would want in a way in containing those sort of issues.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that there are several different ways that governments can assist with addressing the kinds of problems of gang violence that I know are really a serious problem in New Zealand currently. But I think they boil, from the viewpoint of the kinds of theories that I've been talking about, they boil down to just a few kind of major options. One is, that I briefly talked about, is the kind of diffusion option. But I think another, perhaps even better one when it comes to gangs, is to try to get children at an earlier age really interested in other kinds of gangs than the violent ones, particularly sports teams. I think there's a lot of potential there. I know that the people who run the Twinning Project have been very successful at getting politicians on board in the UK. They're now getting very good at getting politicians on board in the US as well. But they haven't made any efforts yet here in New Zealand. And I would love to see that happen. And, so if there are people in the audience here who have the right connections and the right ideas about how we could make that happen, please do get in touch with me. I'd really like to discuss that.
I'll be seeing Mark Mitchell and Andrew Costa in the next 2 days, so watch the space. Perhaps.
Thank you, Harvey. Where two years ago. Thank you, Harvey. That's very interesting. I'm thinking about the diffusion option.
Mm-hmm.
The groups and individuals that I work with are so embedded in a ideological space. Thanks. Are so embedded in an ideological space. I'm trying to think what actually diffusion strategies would work, because they're immovable. They're just so wedded to those particularly extreme views, so extreme right. But the other thing I want to push back is that you said, freedom of speech is important, that governments and agencies shouldn't be repressive or target. But part of what we do when we do that is to protect the vulnerable. It's not about it's not really about the activists, the violent individuals in our community. It's about preventing them perpetrating their violence on individuals, so that what we're doing is providing protection and ensuring cohesion.
I mean, I really understand the powerful intuition that many people have that when people espouse really nasty ideologies, that is the root cause of the violent extremism that we then see. Our research suggests that that's probably not the case, that it's actually, although very unpleasant, and we do need interventions that address these unpleasant ideologies, that's not the place to intervene if you really want to reduce the acts of actual self-sacrificial violence. And in my first or second slide, there was a picture of Nasir Abbas, who was himself radicalized through media exposure as a teenager and eventually ended up, getting involved in all kinds of terrorist activities, but is now helping the Indonesian government to work with convicted terrorists in prison to try to, not to change their ideology, but to get to the core foundations of fusion. And what they do is that they work with these prisoners to draw a map of a river which represents their life course. And this is all focused on autobiographical memories, the stuff that when shared with others produces this fusion mechanism, to occur. And by having this sort of method of sort of getting people like talking about their life experiences. It's a lot easier to get people to talk in a sort of trusting environment about those things than about ideology, especially with people you suspect aren't on the same side as you. And I think that this diffusion approach is likely to prove much more effective than trying to de-radicalize people, change their opinions, talk them out of nasty ideologies. I'm not saying we shouldn't address that problem, but I don't think it's the key issue.
So let me ask a question following on that, which is diffusion is one thing, but is it perhaps more valuable to fuse the bigger group with a bigger group? The example I think you had for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is an example. Rather than feeling that fusion to my Israeli friends against the out team, fuse into one common community. And certainly at the national level, one could imagine that. At the global level around climate change, it sounds like what you were saying also.
Yeah.
Is that a more likely or more difficult path?
I think it has its challenges. I mean, we've just finished a project in which we are studying the phenomenon that we call barrier crossing leadership, which is a form of leadership that comes about when somebody recognizes the shared sufferings on both sides of a conflict. So in our first study of barrier crossing leadership, we took samples of leaders associated with Muslim minorities in London, with travellers in Ireland and black communities in America, all of whom were all leaders who were furthering the interests of the groups that they came from. But half of our sample were what we call barrier-bound leaders, and basically they just cared about their own group. And half of our sample were people that we'd identified in advance as barrier crossers, because they really recognised that there's suffering on both sides, and we can get better outcomes for everyone, including your own group, by working together. And I think that kind of leadership is something that can be fostered and cultivated. And we've got evidence for that from the studies that we've done in now 8 countries from sub-Saharan Africa and from South Asia. But what we have found is that barrier crossers are rare in the population. They don't happen naturally that frequently. So if we want more of those kinds of leaders, if we want more Nelson Mandelas, we're going to have to work at it, I think.
One last question, Ted.
Kia ora, Harvey. As you were speaking, there was an obvious, metaphor around the political landscape and how leaders, Trump being the most obvious, creates the perception of a shared hardship, make America great again. Well, yeah. Who said it wasn't? A dehumanising a common enemy, etc. And you can see how that's used in politics all the time. My question to you, have you seen any great examples in politics where your different approach has been used successfully?
Well, I actually just mentioned Nelson Mandela. He, for me, is a wonderful example of how that has been done. Somebody who, suffered horribly at the hands of an apartheid regime, but still was able to work with de Klerk and, help, sort of bring about a sort of transformation of that dreadful history. I mean, I think that he's not alone. I think a lot of unsung heroes out there who are barrier crossing leaders.
I guess you could say they literally did have the shared hardship and the huge enemy to galvanise them.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think we should finish there. There's some drinks outside at the end of this talk, but I'd like to thank Harvey very much. You can see that this aspect of bringing evolutionary psychology, anthropology, together with the issues of the contemporary world, as just mentioned, is really an important combination. It's where we and Harvey and our international network are working to try and identify ways that can make a difference at different scales from local to global. So thank you very much, Harvey, and I'm sure you'll appreciate him by buying this book. Thank you.